World Antimicrobial Resistance Week is a global campaign that is run between the 18th and 24th of November. It focuses on antimicrobial resistance as a growing global health threat. The WHO has framed this year's campaign around leveraging vaccines to reduce antibiotic use and prevent antimicrobial resistance. We all have a role to play in the fight against AMR.
Today, antibiotics are one of the most common type of drugs used in medicine and make possible many of the complex surgeries that have become routine around the world. If we ran out of effective antibiotics, modern medicine would be set back by decades. The misuse of antibiotics, this causes microbes to adapt to their environment and change in ways that ensure their survival. If something stops their ability to grow, such as an antimicrobial, due to its misuse, genetic changes can occur that enable the microbe to survive.
What is antimicrobial resistance and how is it developed by microbes?
Antimicrobial resistance is when bacteria stop antibiotics from working and they don't get inhibited or they don't get killed by the antibiotic anymore. There are lots of different ways the bacteria can do this. They can develop it in many different ways. So they develop resistance by mutations in the target sites of where the antibiotic targets to kill the bacteria. They can produce additional enzymes to cut the antibiotics. They can produce alternative targets in order to confuse the antibiotic and allow it to not inhibit the bacteria, or they can pump the antibiotics out of the cell as well.
Why is the development of antimicrobial resistance a global threat?
Antimicrobial resistance is a global threat because everything is linked. So we have food, which is globally transported, people move globally, or water also moves globally. And anywhere there are bacteria, you can have antimicrobial resistance. So selection of resistance in one part of the world can affect a person being treated in another part of the world if the resistance mechanism moves.
How do vaccines contribute to the battle against AMR?
Vaccines contribute to the battle against antimicrobial resistance in two very clear ways that are supported by evidence. The first is sort of obvious. If you reduce through a vaccine the incidence of a disease from a drug, an antimicrobial resistant pathogen, then you decrease the need for antibiotic use in general. So you don't need to deploy that antibiotic if you've already prevented the disease. The examples of this would be Neisseria meningitidis for meningococcal diseases and strep pneumoniae for the pneumococcal diseases. We know from data in the US that the deployment of pneumococcal vaccines has led to significant reductions in the detection of pneumococcus resistance to macrolides, to cephalosporins, and to tetracyclines. So the first way that vaccines help is that they reduce the incidence of disease and the need to use antibiotics. The second way is that vaccines and using effective vaccines reduces or suppresses the emergence and evolution of antimicrobial resistant strains as well, because you're reducing the exposure of the population to that microbe, and therefore you're reducing the seed stock for future resistance to occur. A good example of this would be in Pakistan, who have been doing great work in bringing forward vaccines against typhoid disease. Their typhoid conjugate vaccine that's being used there in children is combating extensive drug-resistant typhoid disease. So there are two good ways, supported by evidence, in which vaccines are part and an effective part of our fight against antimicrobial resistance.
How can we maximise the impact of existing vaccines to reduce the burden of AMR?
Well, there are a number of ways in which we can maximise the impact of our existing vaccines to reduce the incidence of antimicrobial resistance. And the first is very straightforward. We just need to implement our existing recommendations, vaccine deployment recommendations. That would in itself have a major boost in our fight. The second is a more social point, that we need the wealthier countries, and I speak, for example, of my own country, Ireland, and other countries in the EU, we have to maintain and expand our financing for vaccines to the global south, and that's a commitment that I'm sure we all as scientists need to lobby our public representatives on.
What new vaccines are needed to fight AMR?
So indeed, we must develop new vaccines to contribute to our fight against antimicrobial resistance. And indeed, as a researcher, the search for new vaccines is something very close to my heart. And it's great to see that the research and development of new vaccines is an integral part of the WHO action plan for combating antimicrobial resistance. In terms of priorities, and these are my own priorities, I would always look to the top priority being tuberculosis, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It's an incredibly important burden upon the global society. 25% of the globe have latent MTB infection. In 2019, we had over 400,000 cases of rifampicin-resistant TB reported. We know that in the same year we had over 180,000 people globally dying from drug-resistant TB. So the point is that if we had a vaccine that could help us combat TB, we would have a major impact, firstly on antimicrobial resistance, but also in unlocking communities from poverty, because the scale of TB disease and the potential for drug-resistant and extreme drug-resistant TB is such that it locks communities into poverty. So we would have a multiplying beneficial effect if we could resolve that. And we should be able to come up with new vaccines if we research and keep funding strong research into a TB vaccine development. As its second priority, or in my eyes, would be a vaccine against Neisseria Gonnorhea, which causes gonorrhea, pelvic inflammatory disease, cause of infertility, and so on. Once this bacterium was susceptible to antibiotics, but increasingly we are now seeing strains, different strains that are resistant to each class of our major antibiotic use, and even strains emerging that are resistant to all our antibiotics, and even cases of treatment failure. So there's a priority here, I think. And this is low-hanging fruit. We have a vaccine against the very closely related meningococcal bacteria, so we know that a vaccine is possible, and that such a vaccine could prevent, approximately 80 million cases a year. So I think that's a very achievable vaccine in our fight against antimicrobial resistance. My third priority would be the Enterobacteriaceae, and particularly the enterotoxigenic E. coli, Shigella, and other related bacteria. These cause significant diarrheal diseases, particularly in the under fives. They contribute also to malnutrition. So again, if we can solve antimicrobial resistance in these scenarios, we can have a major impact on global health. And we know that there's growing rates of antimicrobial resistance in these conditions. We know there are good vaccines in development, so I would say that it would have a major impact and would be something that we should be focusing our research efforts upon. So in conclusion, I've given you, we know that new vaccines are needed in our fight against antimicrobial resistance. I focused on bacteria, but we could also see the inappropriate use of antimicrobials in viral diseases when they're not functioning, but they're used anyway, and also malaria. But my focus really on bacteria would be TB, Neisseria Gonnorhea, and the enterotoxic E. coli, ETEC, and Shigella. Those Enterobacteriaceae, I think, would be important.
The World Health Organization Antimicrobial Resistance has 2 goals for this year. The first goal has 3 different objectives and 8 actions. The objective 1 is to increase coverage of vaccines with impact on antimicrobial resistance. The objective 2 is to update recommendations and normative guidance in both the vaccine and antimicrobial sectors to include the role of vaccines to control antimicrobial resistance. And the objective 3 is to improve awareness and understanding of the role of vaccines in limiting antimicrobial resistance through effective communication, education, and training.
Goal 2 of the Action Framework focuses on the development of new vaccines, which can aid in the control and prevention of AMR. Some of the main objectives that are being put forward for countries across the globe include bridging the funding gap for research and development of novel vaccines which could impact AMR, and also developing new regulatory and policy mechanisms which could accelerate the approval and use of new vaccines that are able to reduce levels of AMR. The objectives laid out in Goal 2 are not just targeted at the scientific community, but also need the help of groups such as policymakers, governments across the globe, funders, pharmaceutical companies, and many more, to help put in place a framework that can help the production and implementation of novel vaccines that have the potential to combat AMR.
Given the long development time for novel vaccines, are vaccines an effective weapon against AMR?
I think, the COVID-19 pandemic has been a really stark reminder of the health and, I suppose, economic hardships of infectious diseases. I think it's really reinforced the continuous need for new anti-infective therapies, but also vaccines targeting newly emerging and difficult to treat infections. And this needs to happen alongside effective prevention measures, accurate diagnosis and global surveillance, as well as our existing antimicrobial stewardship programmes. I think it goes without saying that slowing the spread of AMR requires a truly collaborative approach. No novel class of antibiotic has been discovered for almost 40 years. There's only about 40 to 50 antimicrobials in clinical development at the moment, while of course there's thousands of immuno-oncology therapies currently being evaluated. The rate of current innovation is just insufficient to meet, our current and our future needs. And I think while we recognise that there's a need for new antimicrobials right now, research and development really has been a challenge. The industry is faced with significant economic hurdles, including steep development costs, high risk of failure and long lead times. I think there's broad agreement across all stakeholders that multifaceted solutions are needed, and certainly in Pfizer, we're continuing to evaluate opportunities and partnerships to expand our pipeline.
Is there any education on the misuse of antimicrobial drugs, and why are vaccines of better use?
So I think we know that effective antibiotics have enabled the development of modern medicine. We've seen this in the care of premature infants, for example, their use in surgery, chemotherapy, organ transplantation, and really we've seen mortality rates plummet with their introduction. I think we've also seen the success of AMS programmes in Ireland, shortened hospital length of stay, decreased patient readmissions, reduced mortality rates. They've been shown to decrease the proportion of patients requiring mechanical ventilation, but in particular they reduce the rates of infection due to resistant organisms. And I think while anti-infectives can help to treat an infection once it occurs, vaccines, they help to protect against life-threatening infections and their associated consequences, including AMR. AMR is a significant economic burden, of course, costing an estimated 1.1 billion to our healthcare systems in Europe every single year. And I think vaccines, can play multiple roles in AMS and AMR prevention, by helping to prevent infections, including those that carry resistance. They help to reduce the use of antimicrobials. They help to protect against antimicrobial misuse due to inappropriate prescribing and the spread of resistant pathogens.
What can be done to improve vaccine development pipeline for combating antimicrobial resistance?
From a Pfizer perspective, we're continuing to advance new vaccines against pneumococcal disease and meningococcal disease in particular, to address the burden of those diseases. But we're also exploring potential new vaccines to help fight other infectious diseases where there are currently high unmet clinical need. This includes diseases such as RSV, Group B strep and Lyme disease. We were actually recognised in 2021 for having the largest late-stage clinical pipeline. So our 13-project pipeline is comprised of 7 antibacterial medicines, 5 antibacterial vaccines and 1 antifungal medicine. And these include 7 projects targeting critical pathogens. I think governments, industry and public health need to come together to take action and support measures that enable us to help continue innovating in the development of new antibiotics and new vaccines and to help curb the spread of AMR.
The most important message to take away is that the antimicrobial resistance is a rapidly growing global threat. In order to fight back against antimicrobial resistance, we must work together. Remember, prevention is better than cure. Therefore, leveraging vaccines may be the best way to fight against antimicrobial resistance. This reduces the bacterial infections, hence reduction in antibiotic use. Additionally, the World Health Organization has put together an action framework which sets out the ways in which countries can use vaccines in conjunction with disease prevention mechanisms to aid in the fight against antimicrobial resistance. Last but not least, remember to handle antimicrobials with care.